Great, thank you, Peter. I'm delighted to be here and both participating in the conference, but also to welcome so many who have not been to Jamaica before to Jamaica to both learn more about the country, but also to think about some of the issues that confront both the Jamaican economy and Jamaican policymakers, and I would argue similar issues arise in a variety of different contexts throughout the world. So I'm told I have 5 minutes, and there's a lot that I would like to say, and so what I thought I would do is, first of all, talk quickly. So I'll try not to be incomprehensible as I talk quickly, but also I did distribute a handout which has some of the slides. I think that the print is so small, so those of you who have the kind of eyesight that I have may have trouble actually reading it, but perhaps at least some of you can take a look at some of the things I may not get to. So let me start by saying that I fully agree with the point Peter was making at the end of his brief remarks, which is that there are huge issues in terms of trying to understand ways to strengthen policy making, certainly in Jamaica, but again, that is a much broader issue. I decided that in my 5 minutes I wasn't going to tackle that. I was going to take seriously the question that was posed when I was invited to be on the panel, which is, if you look at Jamaica versus Barbados, that there's a puzzle, and the puzzle is why such poor economic policies as those that have been existent in Jamaica for a number of years could persist given good institutions. And actually what I'd like to do is to argue that I actually don't think there's as much of a puzzle as the paper by Henry and Miller suggests. There are 3 reasons I might say that. One is because I might want to argue that in fact the economic policies have not been so different. In fact, that's not what I argue. I think that the Henry Miller paper does a very convincing job of highlighting a number of examples of how different the policies have been, and there's a lot more that one could say about that, but I actually do think that there have been quite important differences in the policies pursued. A second thing I could argue is that perhaps the institutions were not as similar as the paper suggests, and in fact that's one of the things I'm going to argue. And a third is that it's quite a bit more complicated than that, and I actually don't think that in fact Peter and his co-author agree with quite the straw man in some ways that I think their paper poses, but there's a lot of nuance and complexity in terms of the things that influence growth outcomes, and I'll say a bit more about that as well. So as far as the institutions goes, you know, and I should say that the policy that's discussed in the paper is policies that have occurred since independence, so policies since the 60s. And a lot of the other things that we might look at have happened since the 60s, but of course the discussion of the institutions was from a colonial history. We have quite good, although it's still not perfect, data that compares across country institutional quality in a number of dimensions recently. I would argue that the data that's available for the time in the 1960s is much weaker, if not non-existent in some cases. So let me start by just showing some governance indicators of some of the key measures that are quite common now. That's the second slide on the top row of that handout, which shows governance indicators. That's quite recent data, but was you know, kind of a quick and ready source from the IMF Article 4. It's World Bank data on governance indicators, and I'm going to focus on the rule of law indicator. The empirical data that tries to look at institutions and growth tends to find that the rule of law indicators, in particular property rights and contracting, and this is an average of both of the 2 of those, that those are among the most important of the pieces. But what you'll see there is that the point I'm about to make is true for the other indicators as well. And that is that the recent data show that compared to a Caribbean average, that the Barbados had much stronger rule of law institutions than average, whereas Jamaica had much weaker. So the way to read these numbers is a 33% for Jamaica means that only 33% of the countries ranked worldwide ranked below Jamaica in terms of their rule of law institutions, whereas for Barbados, 83% of the countries ranked below. So one could either argue that, at the time of independence in the 1960s, there must have been pretty big differences as well. Or one could argue that since the 1960s, these institutions, they started off almost identical, but they've changed dramatically. And it seems to me either of those interpretations is an important consideration to think of here. I think they're probably both true. I think that, in fact, there were more differences than the paper suggests at the time of independence, but in fact, that some of these measures of institutional quality are actually subject in examples, and this is perhaps an example in which there might have been more change than in other places, but they're quite endogenous. So I'm going to run out of time very quickly, so let me just move on. My second point is clearly a lot of other things matter, and so the third slide there says essentially I like to think that there's a combination of a range of things. One would be initial conditions. Initial conditions would include the initial quality of the relevant institutions, but also geography matters tremendously, and there are a variety of other things that one may put in initial conditions as well. Policy choices certainly matter, and it's not just the macro policy choices that the paper highlights, but issues in terms of business climate and a wide range of other kinds of micro regulatory things that matter as well. Luck has a tremendous impact, and arguably, and there's studies that have argued that Jamaica had a lot more bad luck on average than most other developing countries for a variety of structural reasons, et cetera. And then I think leadership matters, and that's very hard to, it's easier to model theoretically, it's very hard to measure empirically in these kinds of analyses. So a whole lot of things influence the dynamics and the way that the institutions and other factors evolve over time. And then just very briefly, I wanted to mention some work that I've done with a co-author, Barry Bosworth at Brookings, where what we have done is we've looked at a sample of 84 countries since 1960. And we've tried to study the growth experiences of those countries. Some of the work I think is best interpreted as, in some ways, descriptive analysis, which then highlights the ways that you would look in more detail through case studies and other kinds of analytic pieces. The growth accounts that try to decompose growth into contributions from increased capital per worker versus total factor productivity. You can't possibly see that little chart there, and I don't think I have time to allude to it. But the point is that both of those have been a problem for Jamaica. There have been times in which investment was so low that the capital per worker declined. But it's also true that the efficiency of factor usage has declined sharply over very long time periods. And so both of those things are going on in Jamaica. We use that decomposition to relate growth to a variety of possible determinants, including initial conditions and policy measures. We include institutional measures there as well, and the approach allows us to decompose the channel through which the determinants are actually influencing growth. And so I will just conclude by noting that a number of the variables matter. The institutional quality matters in the growth regressions, and quite intriguingly, it matters through the total factor productivity channel much, much more importantly and significantly than it matters through the capital accumulation channel. So to conclude, I guess my main point is that there are lots of puzzles about why policy has been so problematic in Jamaica, but I think it's not so much of a puzzle based on what the initial institutional quality was. I think, in fact, there were already at the time of independence big differences, and there are a number of other factors, and the interaction between those is much more nuanced, I think, than the paper suggests. So let me stop there. Thank you.